Christ Almighty, I'll never forget the morning of March 3rd, 1943, when I watched an entire Japanese destroyer crew, battle-hardened sailors who'd fought from Pearl Harbor to the Coral Sea, abandon their ship and dive into the freezing waters of the Bismarck Sea the moment they spotted our formation of B-25 Mitchell bombers approaching at wave-top height. The New Guinea sun was just breaking through morning clouds, the smell of aviation fuel mixed with salt spray, and somewhere behind me I could hear our radio operator singing along to Glenn Miller's In the Mood, American confidence celebrating a tactical innovation that had turned medium bombers into ship killers and created terror in the hearts of the Imperial Japanese Navy. I was Captain William Skip Bombing Thompson, 345th Bomb Group, Air Apaches, U.S. Army Air Forces, and after 18 months of flying B-25s in the Southwest Pacific Theater, I thought I understood everything about aerial warfare against naval targets, about Japanese military resilience, and about the tactical limitations of medium bombers against warships. I'd earned my nickname developing low-level skip bombing techniques that turned our Mitchell bombers into precision anti-shipping weapons, had witnessed Japanese vessels fighting back fiercely against conventional bombing attacks, and genuinely believed that Japanese naval personnel were among the most determined warriors we'd face in this war. But what I witnessed during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea would reveal something unexpected about Japanese tactical awareness and the psychological impact of new weapons that violated enemy expectations about air-to-sea combat. Those Japanese sailors weren't abandoning ship from cowardice. They were making rational tactical decisions based on hard experience with a bombing technique that had proven devastatingly effective against vessels that couldn't maneuver fast enough to evade attacks coming in at masthead height at 300 miles per hour. My journey to that revelation began in August 1942, when I was assigned to the 345th Bomb Group, being formed to support General MacArthur's Southwest Pacific operations. The B-25 Mitchell was a twin-engine medium bomber designed for conventional bombing from medium altitude, typically 10,000 to 15,000 feet, delivering 500-pound general-purpose bombs against ground targets or naval vessels. "Captain Thompson," said Colonel Clinton True during my initial briefing at our base near Port Moresby, "you'll be training crews to conduct anti-shipping operations against Japanese convoys supplying their forces in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Standard doctrine calls for level bombing from 8,000 to 10,000 feet." His description of standard doctrine reflected conventional wisdom about how medium bombers should attack naval targets, flying at altitude to avoid anti-aircraft fire, dropping bombs from positions where bombardiers had time to aim properly, accepting relatively low hit rates as inevitable cost of maintaining aircraft safety. But I'd been studying reports from Australian and Dutch pilots who'd experimented with low-level bombing techniques against Japanese shipping, and I believed that conventional doctrine was wasting the B-25's potential as an anti-shipping weapon. "Colonel," I asked, "what if we attacked from wave-top height instead of medium altitude? Could we achieve better accuracy and surprise?" His response reflected the skepticism that most conventional officers held toward tactical innovations that violated established doctrine. "Captain, low-level attacks would expose your aircraft to intense anti-aircraft fire from ship defenses. You'd be shot down before you could release your bombs. Standard altitude bombing keeps you above most AA fire, while giving your bombardier adequate time to aim. But standard altitude bombing was achieving hit rates of only 2 to 3% against maneuvering naval targets, meaning that 97% of bombs dropped from conventional altitude were missing their targets and wasting ordnance that we couldn't afford to squander in the supply-constrained Southwest Pacific Theater. Over the following weeks, I began developing the technique that would become known as skip bombing, flying B-25s at wave-top height, 50 feet or lower, approaching ships at high speed from bow or stern angles, and releasing bombs with delayed fuses that would skip across the water like flat stones before striking ships at or below the waterline. "Thompson, you're going to get yourself killed with these crazy tactics," warned Major Robert Patterson after watching my first training exercises. "Flying at 50 feet over water gives you no margin for error, and you'll be within range of every weapon on those Japanese ships." He was right about the risks. Skip bombing required pilots to fly lower and closer to targets than any conventional bombing doctrine recommended, but the potential payoffs were enormous. Dramatic increases in accuracy, bombs hitting below waterlines where ships were most vulnerable, and attacks delivered so fast that Japanese gunners had minimal time to respond. The tactical theory was sound, but practical implementation required solving technical and training challenges that conventional bombing doctrine had never addressed. Flying at wave-top height demanded exceptional pilot skill and nerves of steel. A single mistake or moment of inattention could mean crashing into the ocean at 300 miles per hour. "Skip," said Lieutenant James Morrison, my co-pilot, using my newly acquired nickname. "This technique is either going to make us heroes or get us all killed. Maybe both." His assessment proved accurate during our first combat application of skip bombing tactics on October 23, 1942, against a Japanese convoy off the northern New Guinea coast. We approached at wave-top height, so low that our propeller wash was creating spray patterns on the ocean surface, releasing our bombs from less than 300 yards distance. The results were spectacular and terrifying. My bombs skipped across the water exactly as designed, striking the Japanese transport at the waterline and creating explosions that sent the entire crew diving overboard before the ship began its death roll. But Japanese anti-aircraft fire had been intense at close range. We'd taken multiple hits from machine guns and light cannon, returning to base with an aircraft that looked like Swiss cheese. "Captain Thompson," said Colonel True after examining our battle-damaged B-25, "your tactics worked, but at what cost? You nearly lost your aircraft to AA fire. Is the increased accuracy worth the increased risk?" His question reflected the fundamental trade-off in aerial warfare between effectiveness and survival. Tactics that maximized damage to enemy forces often also maximized risk to attacking aircraft. But I'd observed something during that first skip bombing attack that suggested Japanese ships were uniquely vulnerable to this approach. "Colonel, the Japanese crew abandoned ship before we even hit them," I reported. "They saw us coming at wave-top height and knew they couldn't avoid the attack. Standard altitude bombing gives them time to maneuver and evade. Skip bombing is so fast, they have no effective countermeasures." This observation would prove prophetic as we refined our tactics and Japanese naval forces gained experience being attacked by B-25s using skip bombing techniques. But the full psychological impact of our new tactics wouldn't become apparent until the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March 1943. The battle developed when Allied intelligence detected a major Japanese convoy attempting to reinforce their garrison at Lae in New Guinea. 8 transports plus 8 destroyers carrying approximately 7,000 troops and critical supplies. General George Kenney, commander of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific, ordered maximum effort to destroy this convoy using every available aircraft. "Gentlemen," Colonel True announced during our mission briefing on March 2, 1943, "this is the big one. Japanese are moving a full division to New Guinea and we're going to stop them. We'll coordinate with Australian Beaufighters and other bomber groups to hit this convoy with everything we've got." The tactical plan called for waves of attacks by different aircraft types: high-altitude B-17s to suppress Japanese fighter cover, Australian Beaufighters to strafe ships and suppress AA fire, and our B-25s using skip bombing to deliver the knockout blows against transports and destroyers. "Thompson," Colonel True said, pulling me aside after the briefing, "your skip bombing technique is unconventional, but it's proven effective. I'm authorizing you to lead the B-25 element using your tactics. Show the Japanese what American innovation looks like." The morning of March 3, 1943, dawned clear over the Bismarck Sea, perfect weather for the coordinated air assault we'd planned. As our formation of 13 B-25s approached the Japanese convoy at wave-top height, I could see through my windscreen exactly what we were about to attack. 8 large transports in the center, surrounded by a protective screen of 8 destroyers, all making maximum speed toward New Guinea. "Bombardier," I called over the intercom. "We're going after the lead destroyer. Standard skip bombing approach, release at 300 yards, pull up hard to clear the masts." "Roger, skip," responded Lieutenant Davis, our bombardier. "I've got the target acquired. These Japs are going to get a surprise." But as we closed to within 2,000 yards of the convoy, something unexpected happened that would reveal just how much Japanese naval forces had learned to fear B-25 skip bombing attacks. The lead destroyer, which moments before had been maintaining formation and firing anti-aircraft weapons at our approaching formation, suddenly began signaling frantically to the other ships. "Skip," called Morrison from the co-pilot's seat. The destroyer crews are abandoning ship. They're jumping overboard before we're even in bombing range. Through my windscreen, I could see Japanese sailors diving off the destroyer's deck into the ocean, abandoning their anti-aircraft positions and swimming away from the ship as fast as they could. Within seconds, the destroyer's AA fire had ceased completely as the entire crew evacuated their vessel. "What the hell?" I muttered, momentarily confused by this unprecedented behavior. Japanese military forces were famous for fighting to the death. Why were these sailors abandoning a perfectly functional warship before we'd even attacked? Then I understood. These Japanese sailors had encountered B-25 skip bombing before. They'd learned through hard experience that ships couldn't evade these attacks, that AA fire was largely ineffective against aircraft approaching at wave-top height at 300 mm, and that survival meant getting off the ship before bombs struck rather than going down with the vessel according to traditional naval honor codes. All aircraft, I radioed to our formation. The Japanese are abandoning ships before we attack. Continue standard procedures. We're here to sink these vessels, not kill sailors who've already surrendered. What followed was one of the most one-sided naval battles in military history. Our B-25s, employing skip bombing tactics that Japanese forces couldn't counter, systematically destroyed the entire convoy. All 8 transports and 4 destroyers sunk, with the remaining 4 destroyers so heavily damaged they barely made it back to Rabaul. But what struck me most profoundly wasn't the tactical success. It was watching Japanese sailors abandoning ships and swimming away rather than manning their anti-aircraft guns and fighting back. These were the same naval forces that had attacked Pearl Harbor with fanatical determination. The same sailors who'd fought desperately at Midway and the Coral Sea. Their decision to abandon ship revealed something important about the psychological impact of our skip bombing tactics. After we returned to base and filed our combat reports, I requested permission to interrogate Japanese prisoners who'd been pulled from the water by PT boats and destroyer pickets. Colonel True approved, recognizing that understanding enemy tactical thinking could improve our future operations. "Why did your crew abandon ship before we attacked?" I asked through our interpreter, addressing a Japanese petty officer who'd been rescued after his destroyer was sunk. His response, translated carefully by our Nisei interpreter, revealed tactical awareness that contradicted stereotypes about Japanese military fanaticism. American B-25 skip bombing cannot be stopped by ship defenses. We learned this at Rabaul, at Wavewak, at Finschhafen. When we see Mitchell bombers coming at wave height, we know ship will be hit. Better to abandon ship and survive than to die uselessly manning guns that cannot stop the attack. This pragmatic assessment of tactical reality demonstrated that Japanese military personnel were capable of adapting to new threats and making rational decisions about survival when continued resistance was clearly futile. They weren't abandoning ships from cowardice. They were acknowledging that our skip bombing tactics had created a situation where traditional naval fighting doctrines no longer applied. "But doesn't abandoning ship violate Japanese naval honor codes?" I asked. "Aren't you supposed to fight to the death?" The petty officer's response revealed complex thinking about honor, duty, and survival that Western intelligence had never fully understood. Honor requires fighting when fighting serves purpose. When fighting is useless, when ship cannot evade, when guns cannot reach attackers, when survival is impossible if you stay, then honor permits survival to fight another day. Dead sailors cannot serve emperor. Living sailors can return to service. This philosophy reflected Japanese military pragmatism that contradicted propaganda about mindless fanaticism. Japanese forces would fight fiercely when they believed they could achieve military objectives, but they were also capable of tactical retreats and survival decisions when continued resistance served no purpose. Over the following months, as we continued conducting skip bombing operations against Japanese shipping throughout the Southwest Pacific, the pattern of crews abandoning ship when they spotted B-25s became increasingly common. Japanese naval forces had learned that skip bombing attacks were essentially unstoppable using conventional ship defenses, and survival meant evacuating vessels before bombs struck. "Skip," observed Morrison during a mission debrief in May 1943. "The Japanese aren't even trying to shoot back anymore when they see us coming. They're just abandoning ship and swimming away. Have we really made our attacks that terrifying?" His question forced me to consider the psychological dimensions of tactical innovation and the impact that new weapon systems could have on enemy morale and behavior. Skip bombing hadn't just increased our hit rates, it had created a situation where Japanese sailors feared B-25s so much that they'd rather risk drowning than remain aboard ships under attack. "Jim," I replied, "we've developed a tactic that Japanese forces can't counter using their existing doctrine and equipment. They're making rational decisions based on combat experience. Staying aboard ship means certain death. Abandoning ship means possible survival. That's not cowardice, it's tactical intelligence. But not all Japanese forces abandoned ships when attacked by B-25s. Some crews continued fighting back despite knowing the likely outcome, suggesting that tactical pragmatism competed with traditional military honor codes in determining individual behavior. During a mission in July 1943, we encountered a Japanese cruiser whose crew maintained anti-aircraft fire throughout our skip bombing approach, even as neighboring vessels were being abandoned by their sailors. The cruiser fought fiercely, shooting down 2 of our B-25s before finally being overwhelmed by the weight of our attack. "Those Japs on that cruiser had balls," observed our tail gunner after we returned to base. "They knew they couldn't win, but fought anyway." His comment reflected the complex reality of Japanese military culture, capable of both pragmatic survival decisions and fanatical resistance depending on circumstances, leadership, and individual unit culture. Some ships' crews abandoned vessels when attacked, others fought to the death, suggesting that Japanese military behavior was more varied than American propaganda acknowledged. The success of skip bombing tactics influenced broader Allied anti-shipping operations and demonstrated how tactical innovation could overcome enemy strengths through unexpected approaches that violated conventional doctrine. But it also revealed something important about Japanese military adaptability and the limits of cultural stereotypes in predicting enemy behavior. General Kenny wants a full report on skip bombing tactics and Japanese responses, Colonel True informed me in August 1943. "Your techniques are being adopted by other bomb groups, and Command wants to understand why Japanese forces react so differently to skip bombing versus conventional attacks." The report I prepared analyzed both the tactical and psychological dimensions of skip bombing's effectiveness. Skip bombing succeeds not just through increased accuracy, but through psychological impact that disrupts Japanese defensive responses. Conventional altitude bombing gives defenders time to prepare, aim, and fire. Skip bombing happens so fast that effective defense is impossible. Japanese sailors have learned through experience that skip bombing attacks are unstoppable, leading to rational decisions to abandon ship rather than die uselessly at battle stations. This analysis influenced American tactical development and helped explain why certain innovations proved disproportionately effective beyond their purely technical advantages. Weapons that violated enemy expectations and left defenders with no effective countermeasures created psychological effects that multiplied their tactical impact. My service continued through the end of the Pacific War, with skip bombing remaining a primary tactic for B-25 operations against Japanese shipping. But I never forgot those Japanese sailors diving off destroyers when they spotted our formations approaching. A vivid reminder that even the most determined enemies were capable of rational tactical decisions when faced with weapons they couldn't counter. After the war, I encountered former Japanese naval officers during occupation duty in Japan, and conversations with them confirmed my understanding of why crews had abandoned ships during skip bombing attacks. "Captain Thompson," said Commander Takeo Yamamoto through our interpreter, "your skip bombing technique was the most effective anti-shipping tactic we encountered during the entire war. We had no defense against attacks coming at wave height at such high speed. Abandoning ship was the only rational response when we saw Mitchell bombers approaching in skip bombing formation." His frank assessment of skip bombing's effectiveness validated the tactical innovation we'd developed and explained Japanese responses that had puzzled American observers. But it also revealed Japanese military professionalism and tactical sophistication that contradicted stereotypes about mindless fanaticism. "Commander," I asked, "how did Japanese Naval Command react to crews abandoning ships during skip bombing attacks? Was this considered dishonorable?" Yamamoto's response revealed complex Japanese military thinking about honor, duty, and survival. Initially, some officers criticized crews for abandoning ships, but after repeated encounters with skip bombing, Naval Command recognized that continued resistance against these attacks was useless and that survival to fight another day served imperial purposes better than dying uselessly. Honor codes were adapted to permit tactical withdrawal when continued fighting served no purpose. This pragmatic evolution of Japanese military doctrine demonstrated adaptability that American intelligence had often failed to recognize. Japanese forces weren't rigidly bound to traditional honor codes when those codes conflicted with military effectiveness. They were capable of modifying doctrine based on combat experience. My post-war career included teaching skip bombing tactics to new pilot generations and analyzing tactical innovations that had proven effective during the Pacific War. But I always emphasized the human dimension of tactical development, understanding how enemies thought, what motivated their decisions, and how psychological factors influenced battlefield behavior. Gentlemen, I would tell classes of new pilots, skip bombing worked because it violated Japanese expectations about how bombers attacked ships and gave defenders no time to respond effectively. But Japanese sailors who abandoned ships weren't cowards. They were professionals making rational decisions based on tactical reality. Understanding enemy thinking is as important as understanding your own tactics. This was my story. Captain William "Skip Bombing" Thompson, who developed tactics that terrified Japanese sailors into abandoning ships, but who learned that terror was based on rational assessment rather than irrational fear, that enemies were capable of tactical adaptation and survival decisions, and that the most effective weapons were often those that left opponents with no viable defensive options. My experience with skip bombing taught me that tactical innovation could multiply force effectiveness beyond purely technical improvements, that psychological impact was as important as physical damage in determining combat outcomes, and that even the most determined enemies would make pragmatic decisions when faced with threats they couldn't counter using existing doctrine and equipment. What struck you most about why Japanese sailors abandoned ships when they saw B-25s coming? Have you heard similar stories about tactical innovations that created disproportionate psychological effects? These personal testimonies help us understand how military innovation shapes combat behavior in unexpected ways. If you want to hear more first-hand accounts like this one, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Tomorrow we'll be sharing the story of Commander Robert Torpedo Patterson, who discovered how American submarine warfare created terror in Japanese merchant marine that went far beyond the physical threat of torpedo attacks. These voices from the past deserve to be heard. Let's make sure their stories live on.